All right. So welcome, welcome, welcome to day 4 of Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And again, I am live streaming by YouTube and by Facebook Live. So if you see me looking back and forth, that's what I'm doing. Checking on both audiences here. So this is the book again. Where do we go from here? Chaos or Community. And we are on day 4 of reading aloud and analyzing MLK's writings, MLK's philosophies and thoughts. Um, it's very, very, very appropriate for the time in which we are in right now. He is directly speaking to the issues that we face right here, right now in 2016. And yesterday we began a segment about Black Power. Today we're going to continue that segment. Yesterday, if you watch that video, you follow the hashtag chaos or community, and you'll be able to find these videos on Facebook Live. But yesterday, he began to talk about how the Black Power slogan became meshed the civil rights movement through the work and through the enthusiasm of Stokely Carmichael was one of the ways that this slogan began to be merged into the civil rights movement. And now we have another slogan, Black Lives Matter, that many people are saying, well, it's based on a lie. Why are we talking about this? You know, why are we using this slogan? But even Black Lives Matter, right? Even in our current generation where people don't seem to understand, even black, white, whoever, don't seem to understand how is that slogan a continuation of the civil rights movement. We learned yesterday that MLK continuously says in his writings that the life of the Black person in this country has not had the same value placed on it as other lives. So if you want to ask the question, how does Black Lives Matter? How does that slogan tie into the civil rights movement and what Martin Luther King then were doing in the 1960s? Martin Luther King plainly says in his own writings, he plainly says it several times, that the lives of Black people in this country have not had the same value as other lives in this country. So that whether the founders of that particular movement understood how their slogan meshed in with the civil rights movement, the reality is it does mesh in with the civil rights movement. It is not something that MLK would not have said. As a matter of fact, he said it several times in his writing. But of course, most of us don't go back and we don't read, right? We only go by what media tells us about what Martin Luther King said or what Martin Luther King stood for. So that's one of the important reasons why we should read, why we should go back to the person who started the nonviolent direct action movement, who was instrumental and key in the civil rights movement, and see what he was saying during that time. One of the things he emphasizes in this writing, which we talked about yesterday, is the fact that the value of Black life in this country has not been equal to the lives of other people. That is the basis for saying Black Lives Matter. Not that only Black Lives Matter, but there's an emphasis given to help you understand that the value of the life of a Black person in this country has been dehumanized. And it has not just happened in our generation. It has happened in generations and times past. So if you don't want to understand that, if you're choosing to be ignorant at this point, that's on you. But the reality is that is a part of, and it came out of, that thought did come out of what MLK then were doing in the 1960s. All right. So just wanted to make that clear. I'm going to take a moment to go ahead and say a brief prayer. And I'm also going to invite some people in to join us live. You can do the same. You can actually, there's a little man down in the corner where you can actually share this video as we going on live, so others will be able to hear the read aloud today. And I thank you for joining me live. So I'm going to take a moment to do that. And hope everybody is having a great and wonderful day. Heavenly Father, thank you for your goodness. Thank you for your grace. Thank you for your loving kindness. Thank you for your truth, Father. But we know, God, that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty, there is truth, there is freedom. And so, Father God, I pray that as we read today, God, that we would have your wisdom, your knowledge, and your understanding, Father, as we seek to be servants to our generation, God, as we seek to understand the times and seasons in which we live and how we ought to move to be a benefit and a help to our generation. Give us your wisdom, give us your knowledge, give us your understanding. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So one of the things that we began about yesterday, MLK started out by talking about how Black Power, how that slogan became merged into the civil rights movement. And he starts out by talking about how Black Power is a response to the inadequacies of what has happened in our country with white persons being in power. It is a response, as he said, to being disenfranchised. It is a response, as he said, to timid white moderates who feel that they can set the timetable for the Negro's freedom, or people who feel that they can determine how much freedom or how much you should ask for in terms of your freedom, right? In terms of your civil rights, in terms of being a United States citizen. What he is in fact saying is that Black Power was birthed out of the inadequacies of what people saw going on. Welcome. Glad to see you here, Galen. So now we're going to continue with his second point about Black Power. Second, he says, Black Power in its broad and positive meaning is a call for Black people to amass the political and economic strength to achieve their legitimate goals. And I think we're seeing, even in 2016, those are the two things that concern Black leaders even today. My age, younger age, 18 to 35, right? The things that are concerning us now is our need to amass our own political strength, right? And our own economic strength in order to achieve our goals. Because what people are coming to find out is African Americans, it seems, have been voting as a bloc, but voting primarily Democratic, right? So if you see the last two elections, over 90%, almost close to 100% of African Americans voted Democratic. Now, establishing a voting bloc was never supposed to be about taking all your votes and going to Democrat or Republican. Establishing a voting bloc was supposed to be about, we are going to vote for and we are going to buy the candidates like every other voting bloc does. We're going to buy the candidates who will pledge and who will vow to take care of the concerns of Black America. None of the candidates thus far have done that. Let's be honest, right? Some of the candidates have given people symbols of improvement, right? But they haven't really addressed in a very impactful way some of the things that concern Black America. We are on the precipice, right, of another presidential election. And many people are disappointed by our current president because they said out of the 7 years you've been in office, you're now taking the last 3 to 4 months to begin to address very minute things that concern African Americans. So the question then comes, if we gave him 98% of the vote as Black people, why wait until the last 3 to 4 months of your presidency to want to start chipping away at things that have been concerning us for 40 years, 30 years, 20 years, right? So the whole point that MLK is saying here is that this call for amassing political strength and economic strength has to do with, it's not about saying someone else is inferior. It's about establishing what Black people need to establish in this country in order to be heard. Because we know we live in a capitalistic society. And so people may not like you, but money talks. People may not like you, but they want your vote. So because we know those two things, it is imperative for us to begin to amass political and economic strength to achieve the goals that's going to benefit Black America. And as Stokely Carmichael said in the reading yesterday, and I'll go back to what he said, he says, Martin, you know as well as I do that practically every other ethnic group in America has achieved their power by gathering their resources. The Jews, the Irish, and the Italians did it. Why can't we? And MLK says, yes, but no one has ever heard the Jews publicly chant Jewish power. They have power through group unity, determination, and creative endeavor. The same thing is true of the Irish and the Italians. Neither group has used a slogan of Irish or Italian power, but they've worked hard to achieve it. And that is what we must do. We must use every constructive means to amass economic and political power. That is the kind of legitimate power we need. We must work hard to build racial pride and refute the notion that Black is evil and Black is ugly. But this must come through our programs and not merely a slogan. So MLK was basically saying, hey, I'm not against the slogan, but beyond the slogan, right? Beyond Black power, beyond Black Lives Matter, you've got to begin to pool your resources and come with programs that benefit your people. Because the reality is, you can't sit around and wait for other people to do what's going to benefit your community. As a matter of fact, if you wait around for them to do what's going to benefit your community, you could be waiting another 100 years, another 200 years for someone to decide what's good for your community and when you should have it. Okay? So let's continue reading. No one can deny that the Negro is in dire need of this kind of legitimate power. Indeed, one of the great problems that the Negro confronts is his lack of power. From the old plantations of the South to the newer ghettos of the North, the Negro has been confined to a life of voicelessness and powerlessness. Stripped of the right to make decisions concerning his life and destiny, he has been subject to the authoritarian and sometimes whimsical decisions of the white power structure. The plantation and the ghetto were created by those who had power to both confine those who had no power and to perpetuate their powerlessness. The problem of transforming the ghetto is therefore a problem of power, a confrontation between the forces of power demanding change and the forces of power dedicated to preserving the status quo. So here, MLK basically says that both the plantation and the new plantation, which is the ghetto, are both problems of who created the power structure, who created segregation, the ability to set you apart in a certain place with certain resources, with certain lack of capital, lack of access, whatever you want to say. So he said there's a conflict here between those who want change and betterment and those who don't care if you have change or betterment or not. There's a term, you should research it, called benign neglect. This was an actual policy that if we just leave certain communities to rot and decay, we don't have to do anything to these communities. We just have to leave them without resources. We're not going to pour anything into them. We're not going to do anything for them. We're just going to allow them to decay. We see that across the country in certain urban areas where benign neglect, the policy of benign neglect, is very evident, where certain cities have been left to rot and decay, whether that's through bad policy, whether that's through the people that have been placed in office that have decided, hey, I'm going to take the funds from that county, from that city, and I'm going to misuse the funds. But there are certain cities we see plainly that have been left to rot and decay without any thought to the quality of life of those people in those areas. He goes on to say, power properly understood is the ability to achieve purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social, political, or economic changes. In this sense, power is not only desirable, but necessary in order to implement the demands of love and justice. One of the greatest problems of history is that the concepts of love and power are usually contrasted as polar opposites. Love is identified with a resignation of power, and power with a denial of love. It was this misinterpretation that caused Nietzsche, the philosopher of the will to power, to reject the Christian concept of love. It was this same misinterpretation that induced Christian theologians to reject Nietzsche's philosophy of the will to power in the name of the Christian idea of love. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against it. So, in other words, if you're telling somebody, I love you, I care about you, I consider you as a part of humanity, but I don't want you to have any power. I don't want you to be in control of your destiny. I don't want you to be, I don't want you to have a say in how you're being treated. What you're basically doing is just giving them sentiment, and your love is anemic. This is what MLK is saying. Because we're telling Black America, he's saying at this point, we're telling Black America we love them and we care about them and we think they're human, but at the same time, we don't want them to amass power. We don't want them to amass economic strength. We don't want them to amass political strength. Because in that context, then you have to start sharing power. And I heard it said that that African Americans, we need to do more in terms of starting our own businesses and those kinds of things. If you look historically, African Americans did have their own businesses. This is how they during the civil rights time, because there were business owners. So if you couldn't go eat at a white restaurant, you could go to a Black-owned restaurant and eat. If you could not sleep at a white hotel, an all-white hotel, you could go to a Black hotel. If you could not ride the white buses, you could go to a Black-owned bus company and ride the bus. So it wasn't that we didn't have businesses. So let's be clear on that. There were entire communities that had strong businesses as well as strong families. But for example, most people are starting to hear about, but a lot of people didn't know about the race riots, which was not a riot. It was jealous white people who were upset about the wealth that was being amassed by Black Americans in Oklahoma. And so they started a riot. They burned down these people's businesses. Lots of people were killed. And to this day, African Americans who suffered that annihilation by their own fellow neighbors who were upset about them amassing economic power. They still haven't been compensated for that. So look that up. Tulsa, Oklahoma, Tulsa race riots is what they called it. But it was basically a destruction of an entire community of Black people and Black business owners, banks, hospitals, all of that. So we are capable of building economic power, but nobody's really addressing what happens when we do, when someone comes and destroys what we built. All right, let's continue reading. There is nothing essentially wrong with power. The problem is that in America, power is unequally distributed. This has led Negro Americans in the past to seek their goals through love and moral suasion devoid of power, and white Americans to seek their goals through power devoid of love and conscience. It is leading a few extremists today to advocate for Negroes the same destructive and conscienceless power that they have justly hated in whites. It is precisely this collision of immoral power with powerless morality which constitutes the major crisis of our time. In his struggle for racial justice, the Negro must seek to transform his condition of powerlessness into creative and positive power. One of the most obvious sources of this power is political. In my book, Why We Can't Wait, I wrote at length of the need for Negroes to unite for political action in order to compel the majority to listen. I urge the development of political awareness and strength in the Negro community. The election of Blacks to key positions and the use of the block vote to liberalize the political climate and achieve our aspiration for freedom and human dignity. To the extent that Black power advocates these goals, it is a positive and legitimate call to action that we in the civil rights movement have sought to follow all along, in which we must intensify in the future. Black power is also a call for the pooling of Black financial resources to achieve economic security. While the ultimate answer to the Negro's economic dilemma will be found in a massive federal program for the poor along the lines of A. Philip Randolph's Freedom Budget, a kind of Marshall Plan for the disadvantaged, there is something that the Negro himself can do to throw off the shackles of poverty. Although the Negro is still at the bottom of the economic ladder, his collective annual income is upward of $30 billion. Now, MLK is not saying something that we have not been saying in 2012. He's saying that collectively, your buying power is such that it can make a difference in the profit and loss of many businesses. So in the 1960s, the buying power or the spending power of Black America was $30 billion. Today, it's close to $1.5 trillion. That's our combined buying power. So one of the things he was saying is that we can use our buying power together to be able to make a change in society by what we're willing to buy and what we're willing to boycott. Still today, we still have people who can't seem to understand this simple concept. It's a simple concept. You don't buy from people who don't support your people group. It's that simple. You buy from each other, and you don't buy from companies who could give a hootenanny about your people group. It's that simple. So again, these are not new concepts being presented to us. The question is, are we going to follow through? Through the pooling of such resources and the development of habits of thrift and techniques of wise investment, the Negro will be doing his share to grapple with his problem of economic deprivation. If Black power means the development of this kind of strength within the Negro community, then it is a quest for basic, necessary, legitimate power. Finally, Black power is a psychological call to manhood. So 3 things he says here. He says, first, Black power is a response to the inadequate response of white America to help us. Secondly, Black power is a call to amass political and economic strength. Thirdly, Black power is a psychological call to manhood. For years, the Negro has been taught that he is nobody, that his color is a sign of his biological depravity, that his being has been stamped with an indelible imprint of inferiority, and that his whole history has been soiled with the filth of worthlessness. All too few people realize how slavery and racial segregation have scarred the soul and wounded the spirit of the Black man. Even to this day, scientists are now finding out that trauma can be housed in your DNA. They're just now finding this out, that yes, there actually is such a thing as post-traumatic trauma disorder, that trauma can be passed on through your DNA. They have found this out with Jews during the Holocaust period, and now they're even talking about the Black American and how the trauma of slavery, the trauma even of the Middle Passage, can be passed on through the DNA. So if that is true, and there is scarring and there is wounding there, why do we insist on telling Black Americans to get over it? We don't say that to the Japanese internment camp people. We don't say that to the Holocaust survivors. I dare you to go to a Holocaust survivor and say, get over it. Okay. Yeah. The whole dirty business of slavery was based on the premise that the Negro was a thing to be used and not a person to be respected. Think about that. We are not too far in this country. We are not too far removed from the ideology and even the laws that Black people were to be used as things and not respected as persons. We still have, unfortunately, in 2016, there are still people in this country who believe that Black people are not to be respected as human beings. In 2016. So we would think that we are very far removed from this kind of ideology, but the reality is we are not. Because we can still see it. We can still hear it in things that people on national television are saying. All right, let's continue reading. The historian Kenneth Stamp, in his remarkable book, The Peculiar Institution, has a fascinating section on the psychological indoctrination that was necessary from the master's viewpoint to make a good slave. He gathered the material for his section primarily from the manuals and other documents which were produced by slave owners on the subject of training slaves. Yes, in case you did not know, not just the Willie Lynch letter, which some people say is fabricated, but what's not fabricated is that there were actual training manuals that slave masters used in how to train people to be slaves, in how to train Black people in this country to accept a dehumanized state of being. That is not fiction. Okay? It's not fiction. So when we look at some of the things that are happening in Black America even now, you can still see the remnants of the slave behavior, even amongst African Americans, even amongst how African Americans think. Stamp notes 5 recurring aspects of this training. So here MLK actually pauses what he's saying to go back in time to give you 5 steps of how a slave is trained. And I'm going to read them to you. 5 steps. First, he says, those who managed the slaves had to maintain strict discipline. One master said, unconditional submission is the only footing upon which slavery should be placed. Another said, the slave must know that his master is to govern absolutely and he is to obey implicitly, that he is never for a moment to exercise either his will or judgment in opposition to a positive order. Second, the masters felt that they had to implant in the bondsman a consciousness of personal inferiority. This sense of inferiority was deliberately extended to his past. The slave owners were convinced that in order to control the Negroes, the slaves had to feel their ancestry, their African ancestry, tainted them, that their color was a badge of degradation. The third step in the training process was to awe the slaves with a sense of the master's enormous power. It was necessary, various owners said, to make them stand in fear. The fourth aspect was the attempt to persuade the bondsmen to take an interest in the master's enterprise and accept his standards of good conduct. Thus, the master's criteria of what was good and true and beautiful were to be accepted unquestionably by the slaves. The final step, according to Stamp's documents, was to impress Negroes with their helplessness, to create in them a habit of perfect dependence upon their masters. So let me break it down for you. In training these Black people, number one, they did it by strict discipline. You cannot do anything. You cannot say anything. You cannot go anywhere. You cannot buy anything unless we give you permission to. That's strict discipline. Number two, personal inferiority. We want you to know your inferiority. We want you to stay in your place. We want you to believe that everything about your past was inferior. We want you to believe that everything about the place that your ancestors came from was inferior. So this is slave making. And we still to this day have Black people who think that Africa is inferior, who think the only thing that's happening in Africa is people running around in straw skirts. Slave making. Number three, we want to teach you to fear us and stand in awe of our absolute power. If I change my thought, if I change my behavior, if I change my attitude, if I assert myself in any way, what could possibly happen to me in a white society for doing so? That's slave mentality. Number four, we want you to be concerned about the master's enterprise, our business. We want you to be concerned about what helps our business run. We want you to be concerned about what helps our economy run, even at the detriment of your own economy. And number five, we want you to have perfect dependence on whiteness. We want you to have perfect dependence on white people. We don't want you to be self-sufficient, because your self-sufficiency means then that we have to share power. So please understand that some of you all are still operating in this model, even though you say you're free. And we're going to continue reading. Here then was the way to produce a perfect slave, accustom him to rigid discipline, demand from him unconditional submission, impress upon him a sense of his innate inferiority, develop in him a paralyzing fear of white men, train him to adopt the master's code of good behavior, and instill in him a sense of complete dependence. So the reality is, as some say, whether you're dependent on the Democratic plantation, as some people say, or whether you're dependent on the Republican plantation, the reality is they're both designed to make you dependent on them. I hope we're understanding this. I hope we're getting it. Because some of us are running from one plantation, going over to the other plantation, telling the other people on the other plantation that they're not free, when the reality is you aren't free either. Surprise. All right, I'm going to keep reading. Out of the soil of slavery came the psychological roots of the Black Power cry. Anyone familiar with the Black Power movement recognizes that defiance of white authority and white power is a constant theme. The defiance almost becomes a kind of taunt. Underneath it, however, there's a legitimate concern that the Negro break away from unconditional submission and thereby assert his own selfhood. Another obvious reaction of Black Power to the American system of slavery is the determination to glory in Blackness and to resurrect joyously the African past. In response to the emphasis on their master's enormous power, Black Power advocates contend that the Negro must develop his own sense of strength. No longer are fear, awe, and obedience to rule. This accounts for, though it does not justify, some Black Power advocates who encourage contempt and even uncivil disobedience as alternatives to the old patterns of slavery. Black Power assumes that Negroes will be slaves unless there is a new power to counter the force of the men who are still determined to be masters rather than brothers. Now, MLK says something here that I don't think people really get. He says there are some people in our society that are determined to act over Black people as masters rather than brothers. Think about that. Because if I respond to you in a way, and some people do it, and I don't think they even realize that they're doing it. If I respond to you in a way, and as a person as a white person, I've had this happen to me. My husband's had this happen to me. I'm sure other people will comment, maybe, and acknowledge this. But there's been times when I've had people speak to me as if they're in charge of me. I'm not talking about in a work setting. I'm talking about just in general conversation, where you're not speaking to me as an equal. You're speaking to me as if you think you master me or you think you own me. And sometimes people do it socially and they don't realize that they're doing it until you correct them and say, I'm an adult just like you are. I have rights just like you have them. And then they will change their response and say, oh, I'm sorry, I apologize, But this whole sense of thinking that you are a master over someone or you're superior to someone in thoughts or humanity, therefore you can speak to them in a certain way that's dehumanizing, comes out of slavery. As he said, some people want to treat you as if they're your master and not your brother. Just had an incident happen this past weekend where I experienced someone who wanted to treat me as if they were in charge of me as another human being, as opposed to relating to me as your fellow human being. This ideology is still embedded in the minds of some in our society. Let's keep reading. It is in the context of the slave tradition that some of the ideologues of the Black Power movement call for the need to develop new and indigenous codes of justice for the ghettos so that Blacks may move entirely away from their former masters' standards of good conduct. Those in the Black Power movement who contend that Blacks should cut themselves off from every level of dependence upon whites for advice, money, or other help are obviously reacting against the slave pattern of perfect dependence upon the masters. Black power is a psychological reaction to the psychological indoctrination that led to the creation of the perfect slave. While this reaction has often led to negative and unrealistic responses and has frequently brought about intemperate words and actions, one must not overlook the positive value in calling the Negro to a new sense of manhood and personhood, a deep feeling of racial pride, and to an audacious appreciation of his heritage. The Negro must be grasped by a new realization of his dignity and worth. He must stand up amid a system that still oppresses him and develop an unassailable and majestic sense of his own value. He must no longer be ashamed of being Black. And one thing I can say, in 2016, we still have people who will get on national television and act like they're ashamed of being Black. We have people who will get on national television and say things like, I'm not really Black, or I'm not Black, I'm American, or what's another one? I don't identify with the civil rights movement. Part of me is not Black. So MLK is pointing out a real problem that is still persisting in 2016. We must no longer be ashamed of being Black. Why? Because God made all color. So why should I be ashamed? My humanity is based on the color of my skin. My humanity is based on my character. Now, if you're looking at the color of my skin and trying to decide whether or not I'm human, that's going to be a problem. So let's continue reading. The job of arousing manhood within a people that have been taught for so many centuries that they are nobody is not easy. Even semantics have conspired to make that which is Black seem ugly and degrading. In Roget's thesaurus, there are some 120 synonyms for Blackness, and at least 60 of them are offensive. Words such as blot, soot, grime, devil, and foul are associated with Blackness. There are some 134 synonyms for whiteness, and all of them are favorable, expressed in such words as purity, cleanliness, chastity, and innocence. A white lie is better than a Black lie. The most degenerate member of a family is called the black sheep, not the white sheep. Ossie Davis has suggested that maybe it should be reconstructed so that teachers will not be forced to teach the Negro child 60 ways to despise himself and thereby perpetuate a false sense of inferiority, and the white child 134 ways to adore himself and thereby perpetuate a false sense of superiority. The history books, which have almost completely ignored the contribution of the Negro in American history, have only served to intensify the Negro's sense of worthlessness and to augment the anachronistic doctrine of white supremacy. All too many Negroes and whites are unaware of the fact that the first American to shed blood in the Revolution, which freed this country from British oppression, was a black seaman named Crispus Attucks. And Crispus Attucks was not a slave. He was a native black man to this country. Negroes and whites are almost totally oblivious to the fact that it was a Negro physician, Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, who performed the first successful operation on the heart in America. Another Negro physician, Charles Drew, was largely responsible for developing the separation of blood plasma and storing it on a large scale, a process that saved thousands of lives in World War II and has made possible many of the important advances in post-war medicine. History books have virtually overlooked the many Negro scientists and inventors who have enriched American life, although a few refer to George Washington Carver, whose research in agricultural products helped to revive the economy of the South when the throne of King Cotton began to totter. They ignore the contribution of Norbert Rillieux, whose invention of an evaporating pan revolutionized the process of sugar refining. How many people know that the multi-million-dollar United Shoe Machinery Company, developed from the shoe lasting machine invented in the last century by a Negro from Dutch Guiana, Jan Maasliger, or that Granville T. Woods, an expert on electric motors, whose many patents speeded the growth and improvement of the railroads at the beginning of this century, was a Negro. Even the Negro's contribution to the music of America is sometimes overlooked in astonishing ways. 2 years ago, my oldest son and daughter entered an integrated school in Atlanta. A few months later, my wife and I were invited to attend a program entitled Music That Has Made America Great. As the evening unfolded, we listened to the folk songs and melodies of the various immigrant groups. We were certain that the program would end with the most original of all American music, the Negro spiritual. But we were mistaken. Instead, all the students, including our children, ended the program by singing the song Dixie. As we rose to leave the hall, my wife and I looked at each other with a combination of indignation and amazement. All the students, black and white, all the parents present that night, and all the faculty members had been victimized by just another expression of America's penchant for ignoring the Negro, making him invisible, and making his contributions insignificant. Now, as an educator, I will tell you that especially our history books are sorely, sorely, sorely lacking. How do you build a subconscious within a black child that they are inferior? Well, if you start your history book off with introducing black people as slaves, that would certainly do it. If you go back to ancient history and you look in your history book as they talk about the Egyptians, and the visuals of the Egyptians are white people in Egyptian garments, then you don't associate Egyptian culture with black people. Because history matters, art matters, correct visualizations do matter. So I am in total agreement with what MLK is saying here. It is important for children to have a correct and proper understanding of their history, even what they know of what we do know about their history. But again, if you start a history book off and black Americans don't come into the quote unquote American history picture in most history books until slavery, what you are in essence saying is you were not really significant to American history except as somebody who was only thought to be 3/5 of a person. So that's something that can be fixed. That is still not fixed. It can be fixed, but it's still not fixed. You still have book companies now who are not even wanting to acknowledge that part of American history. They're now changing the story to even take out shadow slavery. They're saying in one history book in Texas that they finally pulled that Black people, it wasn't so bad, that they were paid to come over here, when we know that's a complete rewriting of history. So these kind of things are important to take into consideration. This is what MLK goes on to say. I wept within that night. I wept for my children and all Black children who have been denied a knowledge of their heritage. I wept for all white children who, through daily miseducation, are taught that the Negro is an irrelevant entity in American society. I wept for all the white parents and teachers who are forced to overlook the fact that the wealth of cultural and technological progress in America is the result of the commonwealth of inpouring contributions. The tendency to ignore the Negro's contribution to American life and strip him of his personhood is as old as the history books and as contemporary as the morning's newspaper. To offset this cultural homicide, because that's really what it is, cultural homicide, the Negro must rise up with an affirmation of his own manhood. Any movement for the Negro's freedom that overlooks this necessity is only waiting to be buried. As long as the mind is enslaved, the body can never be free. Psychological freedom, a firm sense of self-esteem, is the most powerful weapon against the long nights of physical slavery. This is one reason why I have a problem with musicians, with artists contributing to degradation and psychological slavery amongst Black people. I got a serious problem with it. There are certain music and there are certain artists you will never see me promote. You'll never see me support. You'll never see me buy, because they are participating in degrading Black people, Black culture, and participating in mental slavery and re-enslaving an entire generation. And they're getting a good paycheck for it. But the reality is they don't own the music, but they're certainly getting a good paycheck for promoting mental slavery and bondage and mental slavery and degradation of Black Americans. And sorry, I'm not promoting it. No Lincolnian Emancipation Proclamation or Kennedyan or Johnsonian Civil Rights Bill can totally bring this kind of freedom. And now I'm going to put on my preaching voice as we begin to close this segment. The Negro will only be free, truly free, when he reaches down to the inner depths of his own being and signs with the pen and ink of assertive selfhood his own Emancipation Proclamation. With a spirit straining toward true self-esteem, the Negro must boldly throw off the manacles of self-abnegation and say to himself and the world, I am somebody. I am a person. I am a man, a woman with dignity and honor. I have a rich and noble history, however painful and exploited that history has been. I am Black and comely. This self-affirmation is the Black man's need made compelling by the white man's crimes against him. This is positive and necessary power for Black people. Notice, I don't have to tear anybody else down in order to build myself up. I think it's very interesting that the Word of God says to build yourself up on your most holy faith. So I'm going to leave this segment with a song written by Dr. Helena Barrington, which I feel is appropriate for closing out this section. The song says this: I am somebody. I am somebody. I've been washed with his blood. I've been filled with his love. I'm a child of the Most High King. Think about that. You are somebody today. You have been washed in his blood. You have been filled with his love. You are the child of the Most High King. Red, yellow, black, white. There should be nothing wrong with affirming who you are, made in the image of God Almighty himself. So if you run across somebody who wants you to look down upon yourself, who wants you to think less of yourself, who wants you to be ashamed of how God created you, then you're just going to have to say to them, listen, I am somebody, not because you made me to be somebody, not because of the value that you're placing on my life, but because of the value that God himself has placed on my life by creating it. So I encourage you today, as you go throughout your day, I encourage you to stand on who God called you to be. Red, yellow, black, white. The one thing we're not going to do is we're not going to disparage people who are finally finding their sense of worth after being beaten down constantly by a society that tells them that their life does not matter. If you're expecting me or anyone else to participate in that to make you feel better, if you're expecting us to disparage who we are in order to make you feel better about yourself, it's not going to happen. So I hope you got something out of today. We'll be back again as MLK continues on with talking about Blackness, Black power, self-esteem, understanding the need for Black America to rebuild their esteem after having been beat down, after having been crushed by systems that demanded that they act inferior. This has been our reading for today. I hope you have a great and wonderful day, and I hope you will join us again tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Take care, and God bless. Thank you all again for joining us. And remember, I am somebody. Oh, I am somebody. I've been washed in his blood. I've been filled with his love. I'm a child of the Most High King. Until later, God bless.